Have you ever just stopped and wondered why things are the way they are? Why your job prospects, or the price of gas, or even the phone in your hand seem to be decided by these huge, invisible forces? Well, it's because politics and economics aren't two separate things. They're totally intertwined, two sides of the exact same coin. So today, let's pull back the curtain on this epic struggle for control.
And really, this is the question of our time, isn't it? Who is actually calling the shots? Is it our elected governments? Or is it these massive global corporations and the lightning-fast financial markets that never sleep? This is the fundamental tug-of-war that pretty much defines our modern world.
All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with the eternal battle between states and markets. Then we'll get into the core ideas, the philosophies driving this whole debate. After that, we'll see how these ideas play out in the real world with different flavors of capitalism. Then we'll look at how globalization completely changed the game, and finally, we'll dig into why the whole system feels like it's under so much pressure right now. Okay, first things first. Let's get our terms straight. We're not just talking about economics, we're talking about political economy. And that's a field that basically says you can't understand wealth without understanding power, and you can't understand power without understanding wealth. And this is the core idea right here. It's a feedback loop. Think about it. Governments pass laws that control businesses, right? But the health of the economy, whether people have jobs and feel secure, often decides who wins the next election. And this isn't some new idea. The great thinkers, people like Adam Smith and Karl Marx, they weren't just economists. They were political economists. They were trying to figure out this exact relationship hundreds of years ago.
So, over the centuries, three main playbooks or ideologies have really shaped this debate about who should be in the driver's seat of the economy.
First, you've got mercantilism. This one's pretty simple. The state is the star player. The whole point of the economy is to make the nation powerful. You do that by exporting as much as you can, importing as little as possible, and using things like tariffs to protect your own industries. Here, politics is clearly in charge.
Now, on the complete other end of the spectrum, you have laissez-faire. This is the idea championed by Adam Smith, and it basically says the best thing a government can do for the economy is, well, nothing. Just get out of the way. The belief is that an invisible hand will guide the market, and somehow everyone pursuing their own selfish interests actually ends up benefiting the whole of society.
And then there's the Marxist view. This playbook sees the economy not as a system of cooperation, but as a battlefield between classes. It argues that the whole capitalist system is built on exploiting workers. The profit that owners make, what Marx called surplus value, comes from paying workers less than the value they actually create. For Marxists, this exploitation isn't just some unfortunate side effect, it's the engine of the entire system.
So this chart really lays it all out, doesn't it? For mercantilists, the state is the main actor, its goal is national power. For the classical, laissez-faire folks, it's all about the individual, and the state should be minimal, just there to enforce the rules. And for Marxists, the main actors are social classes, the state is just a tool for the rich, and the goal is to completely overthrow the system. Three totally different visions of the world.
Okay, so that's all the big theory. But what does this stuff actually look like in the world today? Let's talk about how this battle of ideas has given us three different flavors of modern capitalism.
If you look around the globe, you can kind of group countries into these three main models. First, you have enterprise capitalism, like in the US and the UK. It's super dynamic, really innovative, but the downside is often massive inequality and a boom and bust cycle. Then there's social capitalism, think Germany or France, which focuses more on social stability and partnership, but can sometimes be a bit rigid and come with higher taxes. And finally, you have state capitalism, with China as the powerhouse example. This model can deliver mind-blowing rapid growth because the state directs everything, but it often comes at the cost of personal freedoms and can stifle true innovation. Each one is a different kind of trade-off.
Now, for a big chunk of the 20th century, these different models just kind of coexisted. But then, a massive force came along and tilted the entire playing field, giving a huge advantage to the market side of the argument: globalization.
The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was this huge, symbolic moment. It really felt like market capitalism had won the Cold War. With communism collapsing, the path was suddenly clear for a single, deeply interconnected global economy, one where money, goods, and ideas could fly across borders faster than ever before.
And the dominant idea of this new global era was something called neoliberalism. It was a complete rejection of the old model, Keynesianism,
which said governments needed to actively manage their economies to keep people employed. Neoliberals said the exact opposite. Get the dead hand of the state out of the economy. Slash regulations, cut taxes, and just let the free market do its thing.
And this wasn't just a theory debated in universities. It became a global policy package. They called it the Washington Consensus, and it was the standard advice pushed by powerful institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. The recipe for developing countries was simple: stabilize, privatize, and liberalize. In other words, open up your economy and join the global market.
And for a while, it seemed to be working. We saw incredible global growth, but it wasn't long before some really deep, dangerous cracks started to show up in the very foundation of this new global system.
Of course, it all came to a spectacular head in the 2008 financial crisis. It started small with risky subprime mortgages in the U.S. housing market. But because the global financial system was so connected and so underregulated, this fire in one house quickly spread and burned down the whole neighborhood. When Lehman Brothers collapsed, it sent a shockwave that triggered a full-blown global meltdown, the worst since the Great Depression.
And the diagnosis after the fact was pretty clear. This wasn't some freak accident. As many analysts pointed out, the crisis was a direct symptom of the system itself, a system that put too much faith in free markets and had let the financial industry become a dangerously unregulated casino.
The economic damage was just massive, but the political fallout was arguably even bigger. The crisis and the painfully slow recovery that followed it sparked a huge backlash against the global elites and the system they had championed. A new and powerful way of populism started to sweep across the globe.
So what was fueling this populist fire? Well, for a lot of people in Western countries, the promises of globalization rang hollow. Their wages had barely budged in decades, while the rich got richer and richer. Good manufacturing jobs were shipped overseas. All of this led to this powerful, angry feeling that the whole system was rigged, that it worked great for the people at the top, but not for anybody else.
Which brings us right back to where we started. The tug-of-war between states and markets is more intense now than it has been in decades. After years of global markets pulling the rope decisively in their direction, we are now seeing states all over the world trying to pull it back. And it leaves us with the biggest question for the 21st century. In this crazy, hyper-connected world we all live in, who should really hold the power?